The day my grandmother died, I did 4 things in order. Crying was not one of them. A sweet potato was still steaming on the wood stove. She had put it there for me an hour before. I reached for the thin gold chain at her throat, the only thing she owned in this world worth anything. Then, the loose brick behind the stove, where she'd saved every dollar from a life of saving nothing. Only then did I call my father. All I knew was that no one was coming to save me, and I had better start counting. The day my grandmother died, I didn't cry. Before I called my father, I took the gold chain off her neck and the cash from behind the stove. When my parents finally drove home that night, they didn't kneel by her body. They went straight for the cupboards. The day my grandmother died, I did 4 things in order. Crying was not one of them. She stopped breathing at dusk in the back room of a wood frame house at the bottom of a hollow in Lincoln County, Kentucky, where the hills close in so tight the sun leaves by 4 in the afternoon. A sweet potato was still steaming on the wood stove. She had put it there for me an hour before, the way she always did, without a word, the way she did everything for me quietly, and never where anyone could see. I carried the potato to the counter first, so it wouldn't burn. Then I came back and smoothed her eyes shut with 2 fingers, the way I'd seen her do for the barn cat that didn't wake up one winter. Her skin was still warm. My hand was steady. I want you to understand that from the beginning, my hand was steady. The third thing I did was reach for the thin gold chain at her throat. 18 grams, give or take the only thing she owned in this world worth anything, and she'd worn it under her collar every day of the 11 years I knew her. So my father wouldn't see it and start doing math. I unclasped it and pressed it flat against my chest, inside my shirt, where the metal was cold and hard against my skin. It stayed cold a long time. The 4th thing was the loose brick behind the stove. It had been loose for years. She thought I didn't know. Under it, wrapped in 3 layers of grocery bag, was every dollar she'd ever saved back from a life of saving nothing. I counted it in the dark, by feel. Then I put most of it in my sock and set the rest back exactly where it had been and pressed the brick down flat. Only then did I pick up the phone and call my father to tell him his mother was dead. He'd be there by morning, and 13 days after that, he and my mother would drive back out of this hollow and leave me alone in it with $53. But I didn't know that yet. All I knew, standing in that cooling kitchen at 11 years old, was the thing my father would never once suspect a child could know, that no one was coming to save me and I had better start counting. My father made it out of that hollow before I was born. That was the story he told, and he told it a lot. He had a truck that was newer than anything anyone in Lincoln County drove, and a house 2 hours north in the flat part of the state, in a subdivision with a name on a stone sign at the entrance and a rule about how tall your grass could get. When people asked where he was from, he'd say the city. When they asked about family, he'd say his mother lived out in the country and was very independent. That was the word he used. Independent. It meant he did not have to think about her, and he did not send money. I know the shape of that house better than I know my own hands, because I spent the first years of my life studying it the way you'd study weather that could turn, beige carpet they made you take your shoes off for, a gas fireplace no one ever lit. On the mantel, in a heavy silver frame, a photograph from a portrait studio in the mall, my mother, my father, and my little brother Cody, all in matching white shirts, all looking at the same spot, slightly above the camera, all smiling the exact same smile. I was in that photo too. If you knew to look, you could find me at the very edge of the frame, half cropped by the silver border, turned a few degrees away from the others, because the photographer had arranged us, and no one had thought to move me back into the group. My father never noticed. My mother dusted that frame every week for years, and never once saw that a quarter of her daughter had been cut off by the edge. There were 2 kinds of children in that house, and the house ran on everyone agreeing never to say so out loud. Cody was the first kind. Cody got the bedroom with the window that faced the backyard, and a bed with a headboard, and a shelf my father built himself and mounted on the wall for the trophies Cody would surely win. Cody got the first plate at dinner, always, handed to him full and hot while the rest of us waited. When Cody cried, the whole house rearranged itself around the sound. When Cody was slow to talk, they called it thoughtful. When Cody was cruel to me, they called it boys. There is a name for what he had, though I didn't learn it until I was grown and reading about it at 2 a.m. with the sound off. Therapists call it golden child syndrome, the child chosen to carry the family's hopes, propped up so high that the propping becomes its own kind of harm. I didn't have the words then. I just knew that Cody was the son, and the house was built to face him. I was the second kind. I had a room too, if you want to call it that, the small one off the laundry, with the water heater in the corner that ticked all night, and a window that faced the fence. My bed had no headboard. My clothes were the ones Cody's cousin outgrew, boys' clothes, washed thin. I did not get the first plate. I got whatever was left after the first plate, which was a lesson so quiet and so daily that it took me 30 years to understand it had been a lesson at all. When something went missing in that house, it was mine. When something broke, it was my fault, whether or not I had been in the room. There's a name for the role I was handed before I could even read. Therapists call it the family scapegoat, the child a household decides, without ever deciding, will carry the blame for everything the family cannot stand to see in itself. I want to be careful here, because this is the part people who grew up loved never believe. There were no bruises. No one locked me in a closet. If you had come to dinner, you would have seen a tired man, a busy woman, 2 children, a clean house, a good smell coming from the oven. You would have gone home and said, "What a nice family." That is exactly how it works. That is the whole engineering of it. The kind of harm I'm describing leaves no marks a doctor could find, and that is not a flaw in it. That is the design. Childhood emotional neglect does not look like anything from the outside. It looks like a child who is fed and clothed and has somehow learned not to ask for anything. I learned not to ask early. I learned it the autumn I was 6 at a birthday dinner that was not mine. It was Cody's. 7 candles, a cake from the good bakery, the kind with the roses. There were relatives, my father's brother Dale and his wife Carol, a few neighbors from the subdivision. Halfway through, my Aunt Carol turned to me and asked, in the bright voice adults use, when my birthday was. The table went quiet in a particular way. My mother said, without looking up from cutting the cake, "Hers already passed. In the spring. My birthday is in November." It had not passed. It was 11 days away. My mother knew that. She simply found it easier, in that moment, to move the conversation off of me, and so she rewrote the calendar, and no one at the table corrected her. And I understood, at 6, that the simplest thing I could do for everyone was to have already had my birthday, quietly. At some point, no one needed to attend. My father found something very interesting in his plate right then. He turned his fork over and studied it. Uncle Dale laughed a half-second too long at something Cody had said to give the table somewhere to go. 2 of the neighbors looked down at exactly the same moment, as if they had rehearsed it. Nobody was cruel. That's what I need you to hear. Every single adult at that table was kind, ordinary, decent, and every single one of them looked away at the same time. And I learned from watching them that when it happened to me, no one in the room would be the one to say something. That silence was the second wound, and it was worse than the first, because the first was just my mother, and the second was everyone. I could give you 100 of these, and the terrible thing is how small each one is. The winter my report card came home with the highest marks in my grade, I set it on the kitchen table, face up, next to my father's coffee, and I went and stood by the counter and waited for him to notice it, the way a dog waits by a door. He read the whole newspaper. He drank the whole cup. Then he moved the report card, without reading it, to make room for the plate my mother set down in front of him, first, full and hot. Cody's card that same week had a D circled in red, and my mother taped it to the refrigerator and told the neighbor he was a late bloomer like his uncle. Mine went in the trash under the coffee grounds. I fished it out that night and dried it on the water heater and kept it, and I have it still, warped and brown at one corner, because it was proof of something, and I had already learned that in that house I would need to keep my own proof, because no one else was keeping any for me. There was the thermostat, too, which my father kept locked in a little plastic box on the wall. 62 in the winter, and the vents in my room off the laundry were the last on the line, so what came out of them by the time it reached me was the memory of heat. There was the coat, a good winter coat, down-filled, that came into the house new for Cody and was worn by Cody for 2 seasons, and then hung in the hall closet for 3 more years while I went to the bus stop in a windbreaker, until it was too small for anyone, and my mother finally gave it to me the winter it no longer closed across my chest. She handed it to me like a gift. She said I should say thank you. I said thank you? That is the part outsiders never understand and survivors never forget. You learn to say thank you for the thing that was withheld from you, and to say it and mean it, because meaning it is safer. Lay all of it in a row, the report card in the coffee grounds, the coat, 3 siblings too late, the birthday that already passed, the vent at the end of the line, and a shape appears, and the shape has a name I would not learn for decades. Toxic family dynamics is the polite phrase for it, the one you can say at work. What it means, underneath, is a house that has quietly decided which of its children the warmth is for, and which one is there to make the warm child feel warmer by comparison. I was the comparison. I was the cold my brother was measured against. The only person who ever said something was not at that table. She was 2 hours south, at the bottom of the hollow, and she said it in her own way, which was never with words. The first time I remember my grandmother, I was maybe 4, and it was cold, and we were standing in the yard of the wood frame house while the adults argued inside about money. I was crying, quietly, the way I'd already learned to cry. She didn't tell me to stop. She didn't say, there. She reached down and took my 2 cold hands and pushed them, together, into the deep front pocket of her quilted coat, where it was warm and smelled like wood smoke, and she held them there, inside the coat, with her own hand over the outside of the pocket, and she looked out at the hills and said nothing at all. We stood like that until my father came out and it was time to be a scapegoat again. That was her love. It never announced itself. It just made a warm place and put you inside it and let you believe, for a minute, that the world had a warm place in it. She never once told me she loved me. She never bought me a new dress or praised me where anyone could hear. In front of my father, she was, if anything, cold to me, short, dismissive, quick to say I was more trouble than I was worth. I spent years not understanding it. I filed her away with all the rest of them. One more adult who had decided I was the difficult one. I was wrong about that, more wrong than I have ever been about anything. But I would not learn how wrong for another 11 years, and I could not have survived what was coming if I'd known. What I want you to hold before I leave this house and this part of the story is that none of it left a mark you could photograph. That is the whole reason I couldn't name it for 30 years, and the reason you might not be able to name yours. I was fed. I had a bed and a roof and shoes, even if the shoes were Cody's cousins. If a caseworker had walked through that clean beige house, she would have written down a healthy child and closed the file. The damage was in the negative space in the plate handed to someone else first, 10,000 times. In the card, in the coffee grounds, in a mother who found it easier to move a birthday than to attend one. You cannot subpoena negative space. You cannot show a judge the shape of a thing that was never there. And so the child grows up certain she is crazy and ungrateful for hurting over a childhood in which, on paper, nothing happened. I need you to hear me say, out loud, before the story goes any further, something happened. The absence was the thing. The absence was enormous. So the house kept its shape. 2 kinds of children, 1 silver frame, and a quarter of me cut off at the edge where no one ever looked. My grandmother was cremated 11 days after she died, cheaply, with no service. My father said funerals were a waste of money for the living, and my mother agreed. And the man from the county brought back a plastic box, the color of a coffee can, and someone set it on the kitchen table in the hollow, between the salt and the napkins, and there it stayed. Nobody moved it. For 13 days, I ate my meals 2 feet from what was left of the only person who had ever made me a warm place, and I did not cry, because by then crying was a thing I did on the inside where it couldn't cost me anything. On the 13th day, my parents packed the truck to go back north. They were taking Cody home for the start of the school year. They were not taking me. The decision had the same weightless quality all their decisions about me had, as if it were less a decision than a fact about the weather. My mother explained it while she wrapped my grandmother's 2 good coats in a garbage bag to take with them. I would stay in the hollow. I'd keep the house from being broken into. I'd tend the garden. There was a school down the road, the elementary in the next town over, and I could go there through the 6th grade, and after that we'd see. But a girl didn't need much past that, she said. A girl who could read and add and keep a house had all she'd ever use. My father was already in the truck. He honked once, the way you do at a dog in the road. On the counter, by the coffee can that held his mother, my mother left me $53, a $50 bill, soft as cloth, and 3 quarters and some pennies she dug out of the bottom of her purse. She left it the way you'd leave a tip. Then she took the 2 bags of rice from the pantry and my grandmother's coats, and she got in the truck, and they drove up out of the hollow, and the sound of the engine got smaller and smaller, and then there wasn't any sound at all except the water heater and the wind in the dry garden, and I was 11 years old and alone in a house with a dead woman's ashes and $53. I have thought about that number more than any number in my life. $53. I want to set it down next to some other numbers, so you can hold them all at once the way I've had to. Because here is what my mother didn't know, standing at that counter, counting change into a small pile, that under the loose brick behind the stove and sewn into a cloth pouch already hidden against my hip, I had $4,683 and 18 grams of gold. My grandmother's whole life, saved back $1 at a time, from a life that gave her nothing to save. $53 was my mother's entire estimate of what I was worth to keep alive. 4,683 was my grandmother's answer to the same question. I have spent my life living inside the distance between those 2 numbers. That first night alone, I did not spend a cent of either one. I understood, in a cold and total way, that no 11-year-old should understand anything, that the money was not for comfort. It was ammunition, and you do not fire ammunition at loneliness. I took the pouch off my hip and I dug a hole under the pepper plant in the corner of the garden where the dirt was soft, and I buried most of the cash in a canning jar, and I kept the gold chain on me against my skin because I could not make myself put it in the ground. I told myself it was because a thief would dig up a jar but not think to search a child. That was true, but it was not the reason. The reason was that the chain was warm now, from 13 days against my chest, and it was the only warm thing left, and I was not going to bury the last warm thing. That is the night I want you to see clearly, because that is the night I stopped being a child in every way that mattered and became something else, someone who plans. There is a clinical phrase for what I lived in from that night forward, though I wouldn't hear it for 20 years. Survival mode. Not a mood, a wiring. A body that treats every ordinary day like a room that might have something in it. I lay down on my grandmother's bed, in the dip her body had worn into the mattress over 40 years, and I put my face where her pillow still smelled like wood smoke, and I said out loud, so quietly I almost couldn't hear it myself, the only prayer I had, I have to live. I went to the 6th grade in a dress I'd taken in myself with my grandmother's needle, and canvas shoes I'd whitened with a stub of chalk so the stains wouldn't show, and I sat in the back, and I was, without trying to be, the smartest child in that building by a distance that embarrassed everyone. That was not a talent. I want to be clear, because people like a story about a gifted girl, and this is not that story. It was survival mode, wearing a school uniform. My grandmother, who never finished the 8th grade, had taught me to read at 4 and to do sums in my head before that, and there had been a neighbor in the hollow, an older girl named Paige Coleman, who went off to the community college and came back with a milk crate of paperbacks she didn't want anymore and handed them to me over the fence like it was nothing. "You've got to get to a big city someday," she said, not even looking at me, tightening the strap on her backpack. "There's nothing out here." She probably forgot she ever said it. I built 10 years of my life on that one sentence. That is how starved a scapegoat is. We can live for a decade on a thing you said and forgot by dinner. But being the smartest child in a poor county school does not protect you. It marks you. And my parents, 2 hours north, had not forgotten I existed. They had simply reclassified me. I was no longer a daughter. I was an asset in the country that had not yet been converted to cash. And every few months, one of them would drive down to check on the conversion. They came in the winter and rented the front room of the house out for a hunting party and moved me into the unheated shed for a week so the men would have somewhere to sit, and took the money north. They came in the spring and took the last of the good tools and the copper my grandmother had saved, and the 2 bags of rice. Again, always the rice. As if hunger were a thing that only happened to me. Each visit, my father would go straight to the cupboards, then to the loose brick, checking, always checking, certain there was money somewhere, and certain a child was too stupid to have hidden it well. He never once looked under the pepper plant. It did not occur to him that I could be careful, because carefulness would have meant I was a person, and it was structurally necessary to the whole family that I not be one. The winter of the hunting party I want to tell you about in particular, because it is the kind of thing that sounds like nothing and was everything. My father rented the front room and the wood stove to 4 men from up north for a week of deer season, $40 a day, and he moved me out to the tool shed to make room, and he did it in front of the men, cheerfully calling it my little clubhouse so they'd laugh, and they laughed. The shed had no stove. It was 19 degrees at night that week. I took my grandmother's quilt out there, and I slept in my coat inside the quilt, and I kept the barn cat with me for the heat of another living body. And in the morning I would come in to make the men their coffee, and they would tip me $1 each and tell my father what a good girl he had. And he would agree, and I would take the $4 and add it, later, to the jar under the pepper plant. I was not cold in my body those nights, quite, but I was cold in a place further in than that, a place that has never fully warmed up since, and I lay there doing the only thing that kept the panic down, which was arithmetic. How many dollars in the jar? How many months of school left before the county tested us again? How many miles to the community college Paige Coleman had gone to? I did multiplication tables to fall asleep the way other children counted sheep. If you had asked me then, I'd have told you I was fine. That word fine is the whole vocabulary of a childhood like mine. I got left off things. That is a small phrase for a large wound. When my father's family did a Christmas, someone would drive Cody up for it, and I would hear about it after, in passing, that so-and-so had asked about me and been told I was doing well and liked it in the country. When my grandmother's small plot of land was finally sold, 3 years after she died, there was a conversation about the money. I know there was, because Cody mentioned it once, carelessly, the way the favored child mentions the meal you weren't invited to, and I was not in that conversation, and I did not see a dollar of that land, the land I was living on, the land I was keeping from being broken into for free. I was inside the family for every purpose that cost me something, and outside it for every purpose that might have given me something. That is not an accident of a busy household. That is a design run consistently for years by people who were never once cruel in a way you could point to, and always exactly as cruel as the situation allowed. I need to name what I was living inside, because for most of my life I couldn't, and not being able to name it is half of what it does to you. Covert abuse. There is no single moment you can point to, no black eye, no broken bone, nothing a teacher would report. It is 1,000 ordinary decisions, each one deniable, each one small enough that saying it out loud makes you sound insane and ungrateful. They rented out a room. So what? They took some rice. Families share. She stayed in the country. Some kids love the country. Every piece, alone, is nothing. It's only when you lay all the pieces down in a row, the way I'm laying them down for you now, that a shape appears, and the shape has a logic, and the logic is, this child is for using. That is a narcissistic family structure, not a family with a bad day. A system with a designated giver and designated takers running exactly as designed. And here's the part that took me longest to say. I loved them anyway. God help me, I did. Every time my father's truck came down into the hollow, some animal part of my chest lifted, some stupid, hopeful thing that thought, maybe this time. I would have the house clean. I would have my report card out on the table. I would stand there while he checked the cupboards and hope he'd turn around and see the report card and say something, anything. He never did. But the hoping never stopped, and the not stopping is its own diagnosis. Trauma bonding, the reason the ones who are treated the worst are so often the ones who love the hardest and stay the longest. The intermittent scrap of warmth, the maybe this time, wires itself into you deeper than any steady cruelty ever could. I was bonded to the people starving me. I would have crawled across that garden for one of them to look at my report card. They never looked at the report card. My body knew things my mind refused to say. I could hear my father's truck, a full minute before it came into view, could pick the specific note of that engine out of any other sound in the hollow, and the second I heard it, my hands would go cold and my stomach would drop, and I would already be moving, sweeping the floor that was clean, straightening the report card I knew he would not read, arranging myself into whatever shape costs the least. The body keeps a ledger, the mind won't. 20 years later, a doctor would put a clinical name to what I lived inside: complex PTSD, the kind that grows not from one catastrophe, but from 1,000 small, unsurvived days. And I would sit in her office and cry, not because it was sad, but because there was a name, and a name meant it was real, and real meant I hadn't made it up. But at 12, I had no name. I just had a body that heard a truck before the truck was there, and a stomach that knew the difference between the sound of someone coming home and the sound of someone coming to take. But someone else did look at that report card finally, and she changed the direction of my whole life without ever once being kind to me. Her name was Miss Turner, and she taught math at the county middle school I moved up to, and she is the reason I am able to tell you any of this. She was not warm. I want to say that because it matters. She did not take me under her wing or tell me I was special or cry over my situation. She was a flat, dry, exhausted woman who had taught in that county for 30 years and had seen every kind of child a poor place produces. And one day in the fall, she kept me after class and put a state competition math test in front of me, the kind the good schools in the city prepped for all year, and told me to do it, and went and graded papers while I did. When she looked at my answers, her face did a thing I'd never seen an adult's face do at something I'd made. It stopped. Just for a second. Then she folded the test in half and said, in the same flat voice, "The registration fee's $40. The school will cover it. You're taking it in March." That was the whole speech. No hug. She opened a door and stood aside. She did not walk me through it, and I have loved her for 30 years precisely because she didn't. She knew something most rescuers don't, that a scapegoat who is rescued learns she needs rescuing, and a scapegoat who is handed a door learns she can walk. I have thought a great deal in the years since about the difference between a rescuer and a witness, because the world is full of people who want to be the first and almost none who know how to be the second. A rescuer needs you to stay a little broken so they can keep being the one who saves you. There is a hunger in it, even when it wears a kind face. A witness just sees you accurately and says so once, and then trusts you to do the rest. Miss Turner was a witness. She never asked me a single question about my home. She never said, "You're poor thing." She looked at what I could do, said the true thing about it, "You're taking the test in March," and then got out of my way. For a child who had been seen wrongly her entire life, seen as difficult, as an asset, as a comparison, as the cold my brother was measured against, to be seen accurately one time by one tired woman was worth more than 1,000 rescues. It did not fix anything. My parents were still my parents. The hollow was still cold. But something in me straightened, the way a plant does toward a window, and once a thing has turned toward the light, it is very hard to make it turn back. I want to stop the story here for a moment and talk to you directly, because we've reached the place I need you with me. If you grew up in a house like mine, you already know the thing I hadn't fully learned yet at 12, that no one was going to come. Not really. Not all the way. The best you get, the very best, is a Miss Turner. Someone who sees you clearly for 1 second and opens one door and then, correctly, makes you do the rest yourself. If you spent your childhood waiting for a grown-up to walk in and announce that they saw what was happening and it was going to stop now, I'm sorry. I waited too. It's the waiting that keeps you a child long after childhood is over. What I learned from a flat, tired math teacher who never once hugged me is that the door being open is the whole miracle, and the walking through is always, always yours. I'll tell you what I did with my door. But first, I have to tell you what my parents tried to do with me next, because they were not finished converting the asset, and the next conversion nearly ended everything. I placed 3rd in the county on that March test. Not 3rd in the school. 3rd in the county, against children who'd been coached since kindergarten, and Miss Turner clipped the certificate to the corkboard by her desk without a word, and, that same week, quietly opened a savings account in her own name to hold the small stipend the competition paid the winners, because she knew. She never said how she knew that any money with my name on it would be gone north inside a month. My parents found out I'd won. Of course they did. In a county that small, a thing like that travels. And it changed their math about me, but not in the direction a normal person's math would change. To a normal parent, a gifted child is a future to invest in. To mine, a gifted child was an asset that had just appreciated and needed to be sold before the market moved. They drove down that summer with a plan, and a woman named Brenda. Brenda owned a diner 2 towns over, and she needed a girl to bus tables and wash dishes, live in, $1,200 a month. And my father had already agreed to it, and already, I would learn, taken the first 3 months in advance. I was 12. The deal was that I would leave the 7th grade before it started and go live in the back room of a diner and hand my wages to my father. And my mother explained this to me at the kitchen table in the same voice she'd used to move my birthday, the voice that made monstrous things sound like weather. "You've had enough school," she said. "It's time you brought something into this family instead of just taking from the woman who took the rice. Look at how it was done, because the how is the education. She did not order me. She did not threaten. She framed it as a moral failing on my part that I was proposing to correct I had been taking, and now, generously, I would be allowed to give. She made leaving school at 12 to wash a stranger's dishes sound like the beginning of my redemption, and she did it in a calm, disappointed, almost loving voice. The voice of a mother finally giving a wayward child a chance to be good. That is psychological manipulation in its purest and most domestic form. Not the shout, but the reframe. The rearrangement of reality so that the person you are robbing believes they are the one in debt. I did not have the words for it then. I only had the feeling I always got in those conversations. The specific vertigo of being told, gently, that up was down, and half believing it because she was my mother, and mothers are supposed to be the ones who tell you which way is up. I did not cry. I did not argue. I had learned at that table years before that arguing was a thing that happened to the difficult child, and the difficult child got less. So I did the thing I had been doing since I was 11 years old, alone in a cold kitchen. I asked for time. 2 days, I said, to pack and to close up the garden so the house wouldn't be a mess. My mother, who read my calm as compliance, because compliance was all she had ever needed me to be, said 2 days was fine. I want you to understand what a 12-year-old did with those 2 days, because it is the coldest thing in this story, and I will not soften it. I got on my grandmother's rusted bicycle, and I rode the 9 miles to Miss Turner's house, and I sat at her kitchen table, and I laid it out like a general. I did not ask her to save me. I asked her to be a witness. I asked her to come to the house on the morning Brenda was coming to collect me, and to bring the principal, and to bring the enrollment papers for the 7th grade, and I told her that I would have a cassette recorder in my pocket running, and that I would get my parents to say out loud in front of them exactly what they were selling and for how much. I had thought it through to the end. I knew that a document beats a family's word, and that a family which has learned it can be documented becomes, very suddenly, careful. Miss Turner listened to a 12-year-old lay out a plan like that, and something moved behind her flat eyes, and for a moment, she couldn't speak. I know now what that silence was. It is a terrible thing to watch a child be that strategic, because strategy that cold in someone that young is a scar you can see from the outside. But she did not tell me I was being dramatic. She did not tell me it wasn't that bad. She looked at me for a long moment, and then she said, "I'll bring the principal." And she did. Brenda's car came down into the hollow at 9 in the morning, and my parents' truck was already there, and so 5 minutes later was Miss Turner's sensible sedan with the principal, Mr. Hale, in the passenger seat holding a folder. My father's face, when he saw them, is a thing I keep in a specific drawer in my mind. The surprise, then the recalculation, then the smooth public face sliding down over the private one like a garage door. He shook Mr. Hale's hand. He said, "What a nice surprise." And my mother, who was never as careful as my father, who had spent so many years certain that no one was ever really watching, that she'd lost the ability to imagine being watched, my mother said the thing Mr. Hale had asked, mildly, whether it was true I might not be enrolling in the fall. And my mother, annoyed, wanting these people gone, said, "What does a girl need all that school for? She'll just get married in the end anyway. It's a waste to keep spending on her." She said it the way you'd wave off a salesman. And in my pocket, the little wheels of the cassette turned, and Mr. Hale's face went very still, and he said, gently, "Ma'am, would you mind repeating that?" And my mother, God bless her contempt, repeated it. I need to slow down here, because this is the pause, and the pause is the whole thing. I did not say anything. I stood by the door with my hand around the recorder in my pocket, and I felt the cassette turning against my fingers, and I looked at the coffee can on the table that still held my grandmother, and I did not say a single word. My heart was going hard enough that I could feel it in my throat, but my hand was steady the way it had been steady the night she died. Outside, a mockingbird ran through its whole stolen songbook and stopped. Somewhere, a screen door banged in the wind. I pressed my thumbnail into the soft old wood of the doorframe, the way I did when I needed something to hold, and I left a small mark there, and I waited. Because the truth I had carried since I was 11, the thing everyone in my family knew and had agreed, without ever agreeing, never to say, was finally sitting on a magnetic tape in my pocket in my mother's own voice, and I understood that a thing said out loud in front of a witness can never be unsaid, and that this was the only kind of weapon a poor 12-year-old girl would ever be allowed to have. Not a lawyer, not money, not a bruise a doctor could photograph. Just the truth, spoken plainly, in front of someone who could not pretend not to have heard it. I have gone back to that morning many times, trying to find the child in it, and I can't quite. What I find instead is a small strategist standing very still by a door, running a plan she'd built alone at a kitchen table 9 miles away, feeling the truth click into place on a magnetic tape. There is a cost to that, and I want to name it, because the world loves a story about a clever child and forgets to count what the cleverness costs. A 12-year-old should not have to think like that. The part of me that learned to, that winter, in that kitchen, is a part that has never fully learned to stop. For years afterward, I could not sit in a room without knowing where the exits were and what everyone in it wanted from me. That is what survival buys with. It keeps you alive by taking the childhood as payment, in installments, quietly, so you don't even notice the account draining until you're grown and wondering why rest feels like danger. Mister Hale did not shout. He did not threaten. He simply said, in the flat, kind voice of a man who has done this before, that a child not enrolling in school was a matter the state took an interest in, and that he would hate for the state to have to take an interest, and he set the enrollment papers on the table next to the coffee can and uncapped a pen and waited. And my father, who understood documents the way I understood them, who heard the word state and did the fast math, and knew that a diner arrangement and a truant 12-year-old and a middle school principal with a folder added up to a kind of trouble that could not be honked at like a dog, my father signed. He signed me back into the 7th grade with his jaw so tight I could see the muscle jump. Brenda got back in her car without a word and drove up out of the hollow, and I never saw her again. And my father turned to me, and for 1 second the garage door face lifted, and I saw what was under it, and he said, "Low," so the others couldn't hear. "From now on, this family doesn't give you 1 red cent," as if he ever had. As if $53 had been generosity. That was the first time. There was a second, and the second was worse, because the second time they did not try to sell my labor. They tried to sell me. I was still 12 when my father brought a man to the front gate of the middle school. The man was in his 40s. He had a truck and some land, and he was looking for a young wife. And my father had told him I was 16, and there was a number attached, a bride price, the kind of arrangement that is not supposed to exist anymore, and quietly still does, in the poor and forgotten places where no one is watching. $6,800. That was the price my father put on his daughter. I know the number because he said it out loud at the gate in front of a crowd of my classmates and their parents at afternoon pickup when I refused to get in the truck. He grabbed my arm, and I did the only thing I have ever done that felt less like strategy than like an animal choosing to live. I planted my feet, and I said, loudly, so the whole crowd of parents and children could hear it, "I am 12 years old. Check the school. I am in the 7th grade. This man is trying to buy a 12-year-old. The man in his 40s went the color of ash and was in his truck and gone before anyone could get his plate. And my father, exposed, furious, stripped in front of a crowd of the very neighbors whose good opinion was the only thing he'd ever actually protected, said the thing that I have carried in my body longer than any other sentence in my life. He leaned in close, and he smiled for the crowd, while his eyes did something else. And he said, "You think you won? However hard your feathers get, you'll never fly out of the palm of my hand. That 6,800 is mine. You'll marry, whether you want to or not." I did not answer him right away. "I want you to sit in the gap with me, because the gap is where the whole life turns." His hand was still on my arm. My classmates had gone silent in the particular way a crowd goes silent when it knows it is watching something it will talk about for years. A school bus idled somewhere behind us, its engine loud in the quiet. A woman I didn't know had her hand over her mouth. I felt the cassette recorder in my pocket, the one I had started carrying everywhere after the first time, running now, and I felt the 18 grams of gold warm against my chest under my shirt, and I looked at my father's smiling mouth and his other eyes, and I did 3 things in order, none of them a word. I set my feet. I moved my arm, slowly, out of his hand, not yanking it, just removing it, the way you take back something that is yours. And I let my breath out. Then I answered. There it was, in what he'd said, the whole thing, finally spoken plainly, the truth, under every quiet cruelty of my entire childhood. I was not a daughter who was loved less. I was not a difficult child who tried the family's patience. I was a thing he owned, an asset in a hand he intended to keep closed, and my wanting or not wanting had never once entered the arithmetic. He had just said it in front of 40 people. And the cold thing that had lived in me since I was 11 looked at that sentence and did not break. It did the math. Because a man who says that in front of a crowd has just handed you the truth, out loud, in front of witnesses, one more time, and I had learned, at 12, in a cold kitchen with a recorder turning, that the truth said out loud in front of witnesses is the one thing in this world a powerless child is allowed to keep. It was Mr. Daniels who happened to be in that crowd. I did not arrange it, though I have been given credit for arranging it. Frank Daniels ran a small education foundation, 2 counties over bright futures, it was called. 1 man and a checkbook, and a stubborn belief that talent in poor places was worth chasing down. He had come to the school about a different child entirely, and had watched the whole thing at the gate, and he walked up to my father while my father's ugly sentence was still hanging in the air, and he introduced himself, and he said, loudly, kindly, so the crowd could hear that too, that the foundation would be covering my education, all of it, through high school, $600 a month, and that he would need my father's signature on an agreement not to interfere. In front of the neighbors, in front of the phones some of them had already taken out. My father, who would have burned down the school before he let those neighbors see him for what he was, stood in the wreck of his own public sentence and signed his name a second time to a second document that took a second asset out of his hand. Then he got in his truck and drove away, and he did not honk. I want to be honest about what that day was and what it wasn't, because I have watched people online turn it into a triumph, and it was not a triumph. I did not feel victorious at that gate. I felt the specific, hollow nausea of a child who has just watched her own father try to sell her and has had to be smarter than him to stop it. Winning a thing like that is not winning. It is surviving, and survival has a flavor, and the flavor is not sweet. That night, I rode my grandmother's bicycle back down into the hollow, and I dug up the jar under the pepper plant, and I did not count the money for pleasure. I counted it to know how far it could carry me and how fast. I took the gold chain out from under my shirt, and I held it in the dark. 18 grams, the only inheritance from the only person who had ever protected me, and I thought about how she'd worn it, hidden all those years. And I understood, without yet knowing the reason, that hiding what is precious is a thing my family taught its women to do, generation after generation, and that I had learned it perfectly. What I did not understand yet, what I would not understand for another decade, until a soft-cornered envelope was placed in my hands, was that my grandmother had hidden more than a chain. She had hidden a whole love in plain sight, behind a face of coldness, for 11 years, and I had believed the face. That is the last thing I got wrong before I got everything else right. And I want to leave it hanging there, the way it hung over my whole young life, because that is exactly how long I carried the wrong version of her, all the way to the top of the state, all the way to a medal, all the way to a city built of the very numbers that had saved me before anyone told me the truth. I want to go back now to that silver frame on the mantel, the one where a quarter of me was cut off at the edge, because that is where this has to end. 10 years passed. I am not going to pretend that 10 years were a montage. They were long and they were mostly alone. Bright futures paid and miss. Turner's flat certainty followed me like a hand at my back, and I went from the county middle school to the best high school in the city of Ashford on a full scholarship, and I graduated at the top of the state, and I won a national medal in mathematics, and I went to MIT, and then I stayed and kept going, up into the thin, clean air of graduate work in a subject that never once asked me who my father was. A test does not care whose daughter you are. That is the thing I loved most about numbers, in the end. They were the first part of the world that judged me on what was actually there. In my third year at MIT, I was helping run a program that taught mathematics over the internet to kids in places like the one I came from, hollows and reservations and dying mill towns, the forgotten pockets where a child like me is born every day and mostly never gets a miss. Turner. There was a girl in one of those video squares, 13, in a kitchen I recognized in my body before my mind caught up, the same kind of kitchen. And one week, she stopped logging in, and I found out from another student that her mother was pulling her out to go work a filleting line at a fish plant. 13. I recognized the whole machine at a glance because I had been assembled by it. And I did a thing that cost me a week I did not have. I was 3 days from a qualifying exam, and I put it down, and I found Frank Daniels' number, the same Frank Daniels, older now, still one man and a checkbook. And I called him, and I made the calls, and I opened the door for her and made sure someone in her county would hold it while she walked through. It cost me the week, but that was not the real cost. The real cost was that to help her, I had to go back into the exact kitchen I'd spent 10 years climbing out of, had to feel again, fully, what it was to be 13 and for sale, because you cannot reach a child in that particular dark unless you are willing to stand in it with her. I stood in it. It was the most expensive thing I have ever given, and I would give it again tomorrow, because once, when I was that girl, no one reached in fast enough. And I know exactly what that costs, too. Somewhere in those years, a reporter found the story the girl left in a hollow with $53, who came out with a medal and wrote it up. And it traveled the way these things travel now, past 100,000 shares, out across every phone in Lincoln County, and the whole county did the arithmetic at last and looked at my parents and did not look away. My father hated that more than anything I could have done to him directly. It was the neighbors. It was always going to be the neighbors. And so, when my father's oldest brother married off his own daughter and the whole family gathered for the wedding, 10 tables of them under a rented tent, my parents were there, seated near the front, wearing the public faces, being congratulated on the daughter at MIT, as if they had put me there. And I came. I had not planned a speech. I want that on the record, against everyone who has since told me it was calculated. When my uncle stood and invited family to say a word, and the tables turned toward me, the girl who'd made good, expecting the pretty thing, I stood up and I raised my glass and I said thank you to my parents. Then I said the thing everyone at those 10 tables already knew and had agreed for 20 years, without ever agreeing, never to say. I did not raise my voice. I said it the way you'd mentioned the weather. I thanked them for leaving me alone in a hollow with $53 when I was 11. I thanked them for trying to sell my labor to a diner at 12. I thanked them for bringing a 40-year-old man to my school gate and putting a price of $6,800 on my body, and for my father's promise that however hard my feathers got, I would never fly out of the palm of his hand. I thanked them, table by table, in a normal voice, for every specific thing, by name, with the numbers attached, and the tent could not hold it and pretend at the same time. I watched the room do the thing rooms had done my whole life, except this time it did not do it to me. Uncle Dale, at the family table, found something very interesting in his water glass and turned it slowly by the stem. Two of my aunts looked down at their plates at the exact same moment, the way they had at that birthday table 20 years before, the same choreography, the same held breath, except this time their looking down was not a wall closing around me. It was a wall falling away from me and closing around my parents instead. The silence in that tent, the silence I had been on the wrong side of every day of my childhood, had finally changed which way it faced. And I understood, standing there with my untouched glass, that I had not needed to raise my voice or invent a single word, because the truth had been sitting in that family for 2 decades, fully known, carefully, unspoken, and all I had ever had to do was say it plainly in a room that could not unhear it. That was the only weapon a scapegoat is ever handed, and it turned out to be enough. You cannot toast a monster and keep believing he is a man of the family. The two things will not fit in the same room. And in the terrible silence that followed, with 100 faces finally looking straight at the thing they'd spent 2 decades looking away from, my mother made a sound, and my parents got up from the good table near the front, and they walked out through all 10 tables of their own family, and no one said they're there, and no one turned a page, and for once in my life the silence in the room was not aimed at me. I thought that was the end. It wasn't. The end was quieter, and it was at home, and it came out of the mouth of the one person the whole machine had been built to protect. Cody was 15 by then, and he had not turned out to be the son after all. The trophies on the wall my father built had stayed a shelf of empty brackets. He'd failed the exams everyone had staked him to, and no one had asked him a single time in 15 years what he actually wanted, because the golden child is not a person either. He is a screen the family projects a future onto, and a screen cannot want things. He found me after the wedding, out by the cars, and he could not look at me, and he said, "You were right. They ruined me too." And then, 15 years old, staring at the gravel, they never once asked me what I wanted. I failed because I never got to want anything. That was all. He didn't make a speech. He asked, in his way, the one question a child asks that the adults have spent a lifetime not answering: why does it work like this? And who decided? And the machine that runs on, no one ever saying it out loud, came apart, finally, from the inside, because the golden child had said it. There was no one left to keep the story going. That is a phrase I would learn much later, for what had been handed down in that house, parent to child, a whole inheritance of it. Generational trauma. Cody had gotten his own version, gilded instead of starved, and it had hollowed him out just the same, and he was the last one to know. I put my hand on my brother's shoulder in that parking lot. It was the first time I had touched anyone in my family in years. He was shaking. I was not. I had done my shaking somewhere else, a long time ago, alone. There was one more thing, and it is the thing that broke me open, finally, after everything else had failed to. My Uncle Dale, who had laughed a half second too long at that birthday table, who had turned pages that didn't need turning, who was not a cruel man, only a silent one, an enabler parent's silent brother, in a family full of the beautifully silent my Uncle Dale, came to me after the wedding with an envelope gone soft at the corners. My grandmother had left it with him the year she died, with instructions that it not be given to me until I was grown. He had carried it for 11 years. He handed it over without meeting my eyes, which was, for him, an entire apology. Her handwriting was on it. The way she looped the tops of her letters. I knew it from a single recipe card I'd kept, the one where she looped the two in 350 degrees, the only piece of her writing I owned. She wrote that she knew. That was the first thing. She knew I had taken the chain off her neck and the money from behind the brick the night she died, because she had left them there for me, on purpose, both of them. And she had lain there dying and been glad that I was the kind of child who would think to take them. And then she wrote the thing I had spent my whole life not understanding, the thing that reached back and turned every cold moment of my childhood inside out. She wrote that she had been cold to me on purpose, that every dismissive word she'd ever said about me in front of my father, every time she'd called me more trouble than I was worth where he could hear it, she had said it deliberately, calculatedly, as the only protection a poor old woman had to give. Because she had watched my father learn to see me as an asset, and she knew she had lived a whole life among these people, and she knew that the more valuable I looked, the sooner they would come and convert me, pull me out of school, sell my work, sell my body, cash me in young. So she made herself into one more voice telling him I was worthless. She spent the currency of her own tenderness, the only thing she had, buying my father's contempt, because his contempt was the one thing that would leave me alone long enough to grow. Her coldness was not the absence of love. It was love wearing the only armor poverty gave it. She had been protecting me, in front of me, my whole life, and letting me believe she was one of them, because a child who knew the truth might have shown it, and a child who showed it would have been sold. I sat down on the ground where I was standing. I want to tell you I stayed steady. I didn't. For the first time since I was 11 years old and smoothed her eyes shut with 2 fingers, the cold thing in my chest let go, all at once, 11 years of it, and I put my face and my hands in the gravel and I cried, the way I had not let myself cry over her body, over the coffee can between the salt and the napkins, over any of it, and there was no one there to make it cost me anything, and so it didn't cost me anything, and I just let it come. I drove down into the hollow the next morning. The house was gone to seed, the garden a tangle, the pepper plant long dead, but I found the spot, and I sat by where it had been for a while. Then I reached up under my collar, where I had worn her chain hidden against my skin for 11 years, exactly the way she had worn it hidden for the 11 years I knew her, and for the first time in my life, I lifted it out and let it lie on the outside of my shirt, in the daylight, where anyone could see it. 18 grams. Warm. It had not been cold against my chest in a decade. I had been warming it with my own body for 11 years, without once noticing that the warmth was mine now, that somewhere in there, it had stopped being the last warm thing she left me and become a warm thing I carried. That is the whole story, if you want it in one image. A cold weight that a body carries long enough, in secret, against the skin, until one day the person realizes the warmth in it was theirs the entire time. I sat there in the ruined garden a long while, longer than I meant to, and I let myself do the thing I had spent my whole life not doing, which was simply to feel it, all of it, without immediately turning it into a plan. I thought about her lying in that bed, dying, glad that I was the kind of child who would take the chain and the money, glad because it meant I would live, and choosing, with the last of her strength, to keep being cold to me so my father would never see my worth and come to collect it. I thought about how much love it takes to let a child believe you don't love her for 11 years so that the child will still be alive at the end of them. That is a mathematics I could not solve at MIT, and I have stopped trying to. I only know that everything I ever mistook for her coldness was the warmest thing anyone has ever done for me, and that I spent a decade carrying the wrong story about the one person who got it right. The recipe card is still on my refrigerator, the one where she looped the 2 in 350 degrees. I have never made her cornbread at any other temperature. I never will. That is where she lives now, in an oven set to a number a dead woman's hand once wrote, in 18 grams, warm against a collarbone, in a granddaughter who learned, too late to tell her, what the coldness had been the whole time. I need to tell you the true ending, and it is not the wedding, and it is not the medal. Years later, my father got sick, and Cody grew into a man who fixed engines and paid his own rent, and had, somewhere in there, been allowed to become a person, and the family gathered one last time around an ordinary table, and it was quiet in the new way, not the old way. And my mother, near the end of the meal, not looking at me the way she had never once looked at me, said 3 words she had never said in my entire life. "I'm sorry, honey. I did not say it's okay. It was not okay. And I have made a kind of peace by refusing, ever again, to call things okay that are not." And I did not say forget it, because I forget nothing. Forgetting was the family's whole religion, and I left that church a long time ago. I looked at my mother, and I said the only true thing I had. I said, I know. I can forgive them. I have, in the specific and limited way that forgiveness is actually possible. I understand now where it came from, the fear and the poverty and the thing handed down through them that they never chose either. I feel something close to compassion for the 2 frightened people who could only ever see a daughter as a thing to spend. But understanding where a wound came from is not the same as offering the wound your throat again. Forgiveness is not reconciliation. I learned, slowly, and against everything that house taught me about blood, that setting boundaries is not cruelty, and going no contact is not hatred, that they can be, in fact, the most honest form of love left, when love, the ordinary way, has become a thing that costs you your life. I did not slam a door on my family. I just finally stopped handing them the key. And the strange thing, the thing no one warns you about, is that the silence I had been terrified of my whole childhood turned out to be the first quiet I ever slept through. The house at the bottom of the hollow faces east. I hadn't known that until I stood in it as an adult, because as a child, the light had never once felt like it was for me. That last morning I opened the door, and the sun came up over the ridge and came all the way down into the hollow, the way it does for maybe an hour before the hills take it back. And it came through the door and lay across the old floor in a long, warm bar, and I stood in it, 18 grams warm at my throat. And I thought about you because I have been thinking about you this whole time. You who are listening in the dark with the sound low so the house doesn't wake. And I want you to know that the door faces east for you too, wherever you are, and the light is coming, and you are allowed to walk out of the house and stand in it. I'll go first. I'll hold the door. Someone told me once that you can love people with your whole heart and still not be safe in the room with them, and that both of those can be true at the same time, and it is allowed. It took me most of my life to believe that was allowed. So let me ask you the hard one, and I want the real answer, not the strong-sounding one. If the only way to keep yourself was to lose the people who made you, not because you stopped loving them, but because loving them the way they required was quietly killing the person you were supposed to become, could you do it? Could you let them go and still call it love? Tell me the truth in the comments. Not the answer that sounds brave, the one that's actually yours. And before you go, one thing from me to you, plainly. If this story felt less like a story and more like something you already knew in your body, I'm sorry. Not because you're too sensitive, because you were right the whole time, and no one with any power over you ever said so. You were not the difficult one. You were a child who needed more than that house could give, and needing it was never the crime they made it into. Whatever you carry, the invisible kind of wound that never showed up in a photograph, the years in survival mode, the diagnosis you finally got a name for, complex PTSD, the childhood trauma survivor you have quietly become without anyone throwing you a parade for it. I want you to hear one person who understands say it out loud. It was real, and it was not your fault, and you are allowed to protect the life you've got left. You were always allowed. I'm glad you're still here. Subscribe, and I'll keep telling the stories no one in your family would ever say out loud. Disclaimer: this story is fiction, inspired by real experiences.